I wanted to start today west of the Continental Divide in California, where they received so much rainfall over the last 4 to 5 days, kind of starting this weekend, then persisting even here early this week. Still a bit of rainfall in the forecast. We'll talk about that. Not as much, I think, as we've seen. Something of a pattern shift, particularly for California in the west, related to this, I think, broader pattern shift we're waiting on at the end of November, which is going to impact a lot of folks, I think, in the eastern U.S. with some winter weather. At least as it relates to today, just looking at the last 7 days of observed precip in California, I mean, it looks almost like it's just focused almost on the state lines there, particularly the Sierra Nevadas where the snow levels have been a little bit higher. That hasn't helped to build in the best snowpack we could have gotten, but it's a good start on the water. We have a long way to go. The reservoir levels in California over the last 2.5 years have been falling some. Not, it hasn't been as dire as it was like in the early 2020s, but we definitely needed a boost. So this rainfall will help. You can see Southern California. There's some portions along the coastal ranges getting up over 6 to 7 inches of rainfall. I was pleased to see that there haven't been too many flooding reports or mudslides. So I think by and large, these have been beneficial rains, despite how much have come through, given we were drier. We were dry this time last year going into the water. That played a large role in the Santa Ana wind events, which caused the Pacific Palisades fire. And looking out into the forecast, I see potentially a Santa Ana wind event during this pattern change in Southern California, later in November, which climatologically is right on schedule. So obviously this rain is a huge help with that wind event coming through, where we're not nearly as worried about wildfires as a result. If we look at the latest radar here this morning along that same kind of region there, off to the top northeast of this, you can see some rain showers that were unfolding overnight across the Corn Belt. Looking southeast California, even the Inland Empire over into central Arizona, some showers still falling here. We do have a few flood watches lingering here, but this activity now waning today as this low migrates from the west to the east, where we're going to watch it later this week come out into the southern plains as a rainmaker. I mentioned that snowpack. If we look just at the water year to date, snowpack accumulations up at the Central Sierra Snow Lab here, this is just kind of near west of Lake Tahoe. Despite the fast start to the water year that I mentioned, we're just barely getting on the graph here with respect to that snowpack. So I mentioned we have a long way to go. Unfortunately, as helpful as the water situation is when we start out quick like this, a dry December, a dry January, dry February, etc., is going to erase a lot of that and the memory of this water year. So we have a ways to go. I'm still worried about California, just kind of given the broader background state of La Nina, but it doesn't hurt to start fast, and that's been the case. It's way too early to look at our basin map for snowfall accumulations water year to date across the west, but if we do, we at least see that the Northwest running a bit behind. That relates to the lack of activity we've seen up there. But Arizona, California, the Sierras, way ahead to start at least year to date, or water year to date here November 17th. So again, too early to call this, the pattern that's going to hold this winter, but it is a map that we're going to update throughout the year. And I suspect by, even Christmas and the holiday season that this is going to look quite a bit different with filling in some of these percentages for the snowpack in the Northwest. Another way we can look at this, just looking at San Joaquin Valley precipitation. Noticed a lot of valley rain events here this fall. And again, if we just look at precip rather than snowpack, you can see we're above average, especially with a lot of these more recent years to start out the year. But, we have a long way to go. Dry December is going to erase a lot of the fast start this year. But it is worth mentioning that 2 wet years in the San Joaquin Valley, both for California at large, started fast. You can see 16 to 17, and then 83, the highly memorable 83. Now, I don't think we're going into an 82-83 winter. That would surprise me, but that year also started fast. And some of these dry years that stayed dry started dry. So at least an interesting correlation just eyeballing this map here for California. So if we look back historically at the 500 millibar height pattern, so where have the troughs been, where have our ridges been over the last roughly 45 days or so since we've gotten into the fall and the water year? Well, we've seen troughing out west with flow coming into California. We've seen ridging over the middle part of the country, like that. We've seen troughs to our east. We had some of those kind of coastal lows along the east coast, and this flow pattern, kind of like this, has kept this area dry with that kind of northwest flow, convergent flow in this region, and has kept this area particularly wet along the southwest. We can see that just looking at the last 60 days of precipitation, where by and large the central and eastern part of the country have been relatively dry, save for parts of the Ohio River Valley, but California specifically, other areas in the west have been a little bit wetter. I think that, again, this pattern that we've seen over the last 45 days, it's starting to change. In fact, maybe flipping around a bit. So the kind of plus sign here and the minus sign here might be becoming a minus sign here, plus sign here, plus sign here. So kind of flipping the pattern a bit. We'll talk about why that is in just a second here. I mentioned just a second. Let's talk about it right now. That's my next slide with the MJO changes that we're seeing in the forecast. So Eric and I have talked at length about the possibility, the probability of the MJO transitioning from the Western Pacific, where it is now getting out fully into the Pacific, doing one of these transitions from 5, 6, 7, 8 to 1. Now, it made the transition along the maritime continent. It popped out briefly here in the far Western Pacific. We had some question marks whether it would get all the way into phase 7 and 8 through the Pacific and complete kind of a full cycle there. We mentioned that as much as 40%, almost half of these events don't make it all the way over there. And we had some skepticism with respect to this November if that would occur. Now, it's starting to look like our skepticism maybe was wrong, to be frank, at least mine, where you can see near-term forecast shifting down back into null space kind of, deked us. It looked like it was headed, for one of these stoppages. And now some of the latest forecasts, you can see bending back out these spaghetti models, as we call them, because it looks like a plate of spaghetti, starting to pull back into phase 7, where it would likely at that point, be free to run into phase 8, doing so very quickly in the forecast as well. And again, if we look, this is just the ECMWF. If we look at the GFS, maybe a little more tepid here, but still trying that more amplified flow where it's likely to rise all the way into phase 7 here. And it's very amplified. It's doing this very quickly. It kind of caught my eye. And when I jumped over and looked at the Hofmuller diagrams, those are kind of those full map, looking at the 850 millibar winds, essentially looking at the trade winds in this area of the Pacific, which often modulates that Madden-Julian oscillation. Well, over the last 2 to 3 weeks, we've seen this steady transit of the MJO and this very classical speed from phases 4, 5 into phases 6 and 7. You can see that slowly here. Now, our question mark was, is this starting to stall here in phase 6 or 7? That was kind of what we started to see, why we started to mention that hesitation. But if you look at like the long range ECMWF extended, you'll notice this pretty rapid shift back to phase 7 and 8. And I think what we're seeing here, look at the 850 millibar winds. I'm kind of watching this convergence zone because this is where you have winds moving from the east to west, those easterlies running up against the westerlies, and it's a lot of convergence in the tropics, like right in this area here. So that's where the MJO has been living, phase 6 and phase 7. But as we go into the forecast below the black line here, we start to shift out into the Pacific, some of these easterly wind bursts, and that's more like phase 7 getting into phase 8 here for the middle part of November. In fact, kind of follow this, you can almost follow it very quickly across. This looks more like a Kelvin wave. So we've had a lot of activity here, and it launches one of these Kelvin waves. You can see that this transition is much faster than, if I draw the convergence line here, it's like this, and then like shoots that way. Kind of your classic Kelvin wave presentation. We can see that a bit too if I jump over and show you the velocity potential. Just kind of another way to visualize what I'm looking at here. And this showcases it nicely where you have a lot of rising air in that convergence zone that we talked about. And then it kind of stalls out, right? We started to get skeptical right in early November that it would really transition, and then there's that quick Kelvin wave. So, maybe not technically a proper MJO transition, but nonetheless, its impact on North American weather, that might be semantics. We're still seeing the support in phases 7 and 8 for one of these large cold air outbreaks in December, which continues to be showcased in the ECMWF extended model, the same one, which is picking up on those long-range chances for phase 7, 8, maybe even into phase 1. So if we just look at December 500 millibar height anomalies, much cooler for the Midwest, East Coast, potential snowstorms, and the Northeast. And notice the West Coast, that flow in California, instead of doing this, which we started the video with, doing something like this, better for the Pacific Northwest, better for precipitation here along the Southeast. Remember, we were worried about this area. So flipping signs a bit here where we're going negative, positive, positive in areas here. If we look at the ECMWF extended, again, the precipitation anomaly, so that's over 30 days, you can kind of see that sign flip that I'm talking about here in that pattern. There'll be some dry areas here, especially with flow kind of coming out of the Northwest. I think it'll be more refined into the Central US. Again, and then we'll add the kind of grain of salt that this is a very long-range forecast. We are seeing some stars align with the forecast, that MJO transition. That's not set in stone. That Kelvin wave could be weaker than expected or not. I know that sounds like a non-answer here at 6 a.m. in the morning. And it is. It's always going to be, less than a firm answer in the long range. It just so happens that I'm kind of covering this earlier here today than I typically would, given that we're starting to see that pattern flip emerge in the long range. I want to jump over, kind of shifting over toward Hawaii for a second. This was a video of Kilauea erupting over on Hawaii's Big Island. And these lava fountains were impressive. There's been a number of eruptions over on the Big Island over the last kind of 2 or 3 years as Kilauea has sparked up again. But these lava streams here were just crazy, seeing videos of these. This is all from the USGS here. I want to go back to that first one. They actually measured the height of some of these, and one of them I think got up to 1,500 feet, these lava fountains. They don't look, they look like a few hundred feet from my eye, but to put into perspective, 1,500 feet's that'd be like the tallest skyscraper in the U.S. You're getting over like the Willis Tower in Chicago, the World Trade Center 1 at that point. So pretty intimidating. Think about lava fountains shooting that high up, but it's pretty cool to watch on webcam. They've even launched some of these little land spout tornado things because of all the heat and the rising air there over in Hawaii. It's kind of neat to see that from the USGS. I want to jump over and start with the all hazards map. You'll notice that I'm pulling this right from the National Weather Service here this morning because we had a large server outage across the U.S. overnight. It took our site down, agweather.com, took Twitter down. I was able, Twitter's slowly coming back up. Our site's kind of slowly coming back up. Here's a 6:30. My guess is by the time I publish this video that it will have resolved. But in the meantime, I've had to kind of jump around at different websites here to showcase some of what we usually just have compiled on AgWeather, so I apologize for that. But I don't mind going right to the source here from the National Weather Service, where do you see those flood watches along the Colorado River up into Las Vegas? Just had a busy weather this fall. And elsewhere across the country, pretty light. Some winter weather advisories here in southeast Ohio, central Wisconsin. But otherwise, not too much to talk about east of the Continental Divide, apart from some marginal severe weather, which I'll mention in just a second here. I want to jump over this kind of a different view than I usually show this morning with the outage. Why not, I thought. So I'm going to start here. This is our 500 millibar flow pattern, but instead of showing you those troughs and ridges, kind of the red colors implying higher heights, the blue colors identifying those troughs, this is looking at vorticity, a plot we look at occasionally in the mid-levels of the atmosphere. It often points us out, where our next weather makers are going to be in the form of these little shortwave troughs that sneak through the country and produce inclement weather. These long-wave troughs typically produce larger storms, those big deep low pressure systems, and severe weather, so we have to keep an eye on those when they roll through as well. Now this morning from the ECMWF, I'll make this valid about the recording of this video. We have a shortwave trough moving through Iowa here. That helped to produce some of those showers out ahead of it overnight in the Corn Belt. There's our cutoff flow over California. And here's our next weather maker coming out of the North Pacific, which is going to be working its way west to east through this forecast here. So I'm going to take the video or the forecast here through today on Tuesday. That shortwave makes its way into Ohio. Actually seeing a little bit of a storm threat here in the Ohio River Valley as a result. As this cutoff low moves into Arizona, that's why we saw those increasing precip values there, the flood watches here for the Colorado River Valley, and that precip's going to be making its way across the southern U.S., and then that next system coming in behind it, making its way into California again by Thursday. Our cutoff low still sneaking through southern U.S. here by Thursday morning, and then we have another system moving through the Canadian Prairie. That low kind of weakens as it comes out into the southern U.S. We've seen this low weaken in the forecast now, almost just a blip by this weekend. It will be a rainmaker, might get some storms out of it, but not nearly as strong as it was earlier. And now we've replaced it, that next system cutting off again in Southern California here this weekend. And that's going to kind of slowly meander through the Four Corners on Sunday before coming out into the central U.S. mid next week. Now, this isn't the busiest pattern. It is kind of in this corridor here. But save for this area, relatively dry until we get better flow across the northern U.S. And you'll see that as we get late into next week, like Thanksgiving, a better long wave trough presentation now across the Midwest and the eastern U.S. This will bring in our first kind of this pattern change, or maybe first big cold front through this area here. Rain chances for the eastern U.S. And then I see another system diving down into California. The trajectory of this one kind of along the coast and inland like this is better for Santa Ana wind events. That's why I mentioned that concern near the end of November. That presentation looks similar to some other Santa Ana wind events that we've had. Now, fortunately, with all the rain, that urban wildfire threat has been greatly or significantly reduced. And then that pulls up into a big deep low across the central U.S. late in November. Now, we're too far out in the forecast time to talk specifics at that point, but we do see here, at least by the end of this forecast, is better flow coming in this region, diving down to that trough that we mentioned in that pattern change, and then finally ridging developing here more so over the Northeast Pacific, kind of potentially ending this fast start to the California water year. Now that shortwave I mentioned across Iowa, rather than looking at the models, we can just identify it here on the mid-level water vapor loop from our satellite here this morning. There's showers moving through the Ohio River Valley. The Storm Prediction Center has actually given a marginal risk for southern Illinois, Indiana, Kentucky, far northern Tennessee, and the boot heel of Missouri here, and maybe just north of that. This is for tornadoes, wind, and slight hail chances. Again, the lowest values for each of those. So not expecting a memorable severe weather day, but can't rule out, maybe a very weak tornado and a few wind reports in the Ohio River Valley. Jump over and look at the ECMWF, their precipitation forecast, kind of putting this all together here. I'm going to take us through this evening, whereby dinner time, showers and storms across the Kentucky region, again, the Ohio River Valley, just light showers associated with that cutoff low through Arizona, far eastern California, even into Nevada and Utah here. Take this forecast into Wednesday and Thursday. Some of those showers and storms starting to get out into the southern plains now by Thursday at lunchtime. Still seeing some showers percolate over California as that next low comes in. And then by late Thursday into early Friday, this weak system here, still seeing some convection, Arkansas, across the mid-south, getting to the Ohio River Valley, but stronger rainfall values showing up here for southern California with that next low coming in behind it. Remember, this one moves very slowly across the four corners this weekend. Rain weakening with this weak low that's dying out here over the southeast. And now this cutoff low sneaking across by Sunday, bringing Texas precipitation back in by late Sunday, early Monday. And then this is the point mid next week, that cold front showing up associated with this low over Ontario. That low kicks out in front of that cold front, and we have a much deeper cold front and low now developing across New York. Maybe kind of a brief coastal system here for New England. This is late next week, Thanksgiving. Much cooler air on the backside of this for Thanksgiving weekend. Better flow into the Pacific Northwest now, well out into the forecast here. Don't want to talk too much specifics, but there's this bigger pattern change. Huge deep low across Minnesota, often accompanied with these kind of wintertime pattern changes. Another deep one here developing over western Montana. This would be a wind event. Again, too far out. It's not going to play out just like this. In fact, if we jump over and look at the GFS, you'll see it already starts to look different at that range. I'm going to play this forecast forward. There's that weak low this week over the eastern U.S. That next low cuts through. I'm doing this quickly to highlight some differences when they show up. Mid next week, there goes that low across the east. The strong cold front in behind it on Thanksgiving. Maybe not quite as strong from the GFS. And then late November, kind of the end of Thanksgiving weekend, that big deep low, rather than curling all the way up into Minnesota, kind of stretches out into a pressure trough across the Midwest and the Northeast, but much deeper cool air behind it in this pattern shift. And we're going wetter here for the Southeast far in the GFS. So again, this kind of highlights, if I just play this back a little bit, remember the sign change was positive here, going negative, now looking positive here, and looking positive here. Maybe a little bit drier here if we scrutinize it a bit in the forecast. If we look at the 7-day precip anomalies from the ECMWF, well, with those cutoff lows sneaking through California and then into the southern plains, better precipitation for that quarter here, but still dry in areas of the east and the Pacific Northwest. But I can drag this 7-day anomaly out, so we're just pulling it out into late November at this point. If I take this to like December 3rd, there's that sign flip that I was talking about. And this is good news for this corridor, because remember, we started this video talking about the drought that had been settling in here. And this shifting over wetter is reducing some of our drought concern that we've talked about even next year into 2026, along with El Nino chances rising, further out into 2026. We're starting to take away some of these concerns for drought into 2026. Again, very early to kind of talk firmly about that potential, but not quite as concerning as it was earlier when we were dealing with the fall drought across a wide area of the eastern U.S. I'm going to do that same thought experiment with the GFS, with that 7-day rolling window. You can see a lot of the activity here focused on the southern U.S., the Ohio River Valley. I'm going to play this forecast out as we get into late November. Thanksgiving weekend shows up into the time range here. Pacific Northwest goes wet. Eastern U.S. goes wet, maybe a little bit drier for the southeast. I'd like to see this area fill in with some rainfall here, but going drier for California as well. Temperature-wise, as you'd imagine, we're going to flip those around as well. So these are 1-day rolling temperature anomalies, much warmer across the eastern U.S. with these lows sneaking through because they're pulling up warm air out ahead of it. Cool, where we're precipitating in California and Arizona, and that remains the case into mid next week. But as that first cold front comes through, Temperatures fall back well below freezing in the Midwest. That stretches all the way over to the Atlantic coast. We shift warmer back west, warmer over the Hudson Bay, but I want you to watch the Canadian Prairie here as we go further out into the forecast, way out. Now we're getting into December. Very cold Arctic air starting to settle into the prairie, and even some of this getting into the plains. And this is kind of this loading pattern that we've mentioned, where can this be ushered from here into here, where we have a huge start to our December wintertime pattern? Well, if we look at that long range forecast again, that had that kind of deeper low across the Midwest, you could make the case pretty easily that yes. And this is very cold Arctic air. Just looking at some of these temperature values, you're down into like negative 20 Celsius, negative 30 Celsius up here in like close to the Northwest Territories. This is Arctic air. This is getting down into like, negative 5, negative 10 degrees Fahrenheit. And it wouldn't take much to kind of usher it out of that into the U.S. And if you want to see like phases in December, that would be good for that. Go to like phase 7 in mid-December. You get a big Hudson Bay trough, and we're going to pull that cold air right into the central U.S. or the eastern U.S. What about like phase 8? Remember, we were starting to see that transition by mid-December. Same scenario. If we flip back to like phase 5, we don't see as much support for that. So that's why that kind of MJO conversation is so important when we start to look out into mid-December. Now, the 8 to 14-day temperature outlook from the Climate Prediction Center, we still saw that cold air kind of hold up here in the Canadian Prairie, if not Montana. Better precipitation values across the central and eastern U.S. And it's really it would be more so into December, that like week to 3 to 4 time frame, or at least per the last update from the CPC, they're starting to identify that possibility of that cold air bleeding out of there, and potentially these kind of like Miller B systems sneaking up into the northeast, potential nor'easter situation. So that's the scenario we're watching for early to mid-December. I want to see how it plays out. I think this pattern shift is important for the drought conversation that we mentioned. If we just look at the drought change in classification, over the last 8 weeks, we've been wetter across the western U.S. and by and large drier across the eastern U.S., save for the Ohio River Valley. Texas, we're going to be improving precipitation chances here. Southeast, we'll have chances here to get rainfall in. The GFS wasn't as friendly with that, but I'm more excited for rainfall chances now over the eastern U.S., certainly snowfall for the upper Midwest, than I was earlier in like late September, going into October. It's still fall. We have time to work back some of this fall drought that we've been worried about for 2026. Last thing I want to mention here, the PDO, the Pacific Decadal Oscillation, something Eric and I have talked about quite a bit over summer as it related to the growing season. It has been very negative this autumn. In fact, the water temperatures were so warm earlier in autumn in this corridor here that we reached record negative PDO values in 2025. And what we see typically with a PDO is a lot of warm water here and then cold water kind of on the periphery of that here. So like typically we get a negative PDO with a La Nina. We see that now. And we get cold waters in the Gulf of Alaska and over here in the Northwest Pacific. So we're seeing that now. And kind of curiously, this area has gone much warmer over the last 5 years. And, funny enough, there was this kind of international agreement to reduce pollutants in a lot of the shipping traffic across the North Pacific. And that's good news because we're reducing pollution. But there's kind of this bizarre phenomenon that has a lot of us wondering now, and there's even been some papers on this. And I pulled this loop critically from 2019, before the agreement was reached. And you used to see in the North Pacific, as these are ships tracking through the North Pacific, they'd leave these cloud streets, you see? And you can actually see the forward motion of the ships. And the exhaust and the pollutants in that were good cloud condensation nuclei, and would help form a lot of clouds across the North Pacific. And we kind of wonder what role the lack of clouds now might be playing on this warmth in the North Pacific. Because as you can imagine, there is just a tremendous amount of trade and shipping traffic in this area here. Is it possible that the lack of shipping track clouds are allowing this water to warm up quicker with a lot more sunshine throughout the year? That might be the case. And that's relevant for our weather. We talked about it for the growing season. And if we look at wintertime correlations with just air temperature, that's what I'm starting with here, with, let's do the full December through February correlation. This is shipping track changes. 500 millibar air temperature. And actually, what I want to do, these are some more troughing during positive PDO scenarios here, more ridging here. But we have to flip that sign because we're highly negative. And so really this is more warmth in this area here and colder weather in Canada, which is kind of curious. And if you think about where we ended the forecast, very cold here, warmer in some areas here, although we did have some cold fronts sneaking through. It kind of makes me wonder about that connection there. But I did pull it up for December specifically, and we saw less correlations with the ridging here across the eastern U.S. in the negative PDO scenario. So personally in winter, I'm not a huge fan of the PDO. I think it can kind of mask some more important week-to-week variability, but at least with respect to like where we're going in January, February, this is something I'm going to keep in the back of my mind that, we might have more support for ridging here going into January and February, and that wouldn't necessarily bode well for that southeast drought scenario. It would also seem to suggest, a very cold heart of winter for the Canadian prairie where we can get some of these cold air outbreaks as a result of that. We'll have to see where that goes when we get to it. I don't want to get too far ahead. I'll finish my last slide here as I wrap up with an announcement that came from Google yesterday. They released a paper earlier this year about their Weather Next machine learning forecast model that's performed very well. They were kind of one of the first ones to produce a really reliable AI weather model back in 2023 that did very well in a lot of these different forecast accuracy metrics that we tracked. They released a big update to it yesterday. We're going to hope to get that on the AgWeather site, but it was kind of interesting. I was reading the paper yesterday, and they do something that's kind of neat. They start similarly with what we do with our numerical weather prediction models with the GFS and the ECMWF, with all the inputs that go into these models. But they actually noticed that they improved their forecast accuracy by injecting noise into the functions, which govern a lot of these AI models. And by just injecting random noise, methodologically, they were able to produce better forecasts, which kind of reminds me of when we build some of these corn yielding models and some of these other crop yielding models. We actually have to do a similar thing where we inject more physical variability into the weather throughout the year to grow a more realistic corn or soybean crop. And why exactly that's the case, we don't know. And then what's neat is in the paper, they also say they don't really know why that's improving their forecast. So I think it's because nature and corn and weather systems, they're chaotic. There's odd gusts of wind throughout the day and all that, is maybe needed to grow a crop or cause a cold front. It's kind of interesting to think about in a broader kind of natural phenomenon sense. But I'm not going to dive too deep into it. Certainly not going to talk you through all the graphs here in this paper, but they have improved their forecast as a result of this noise injection. And the forecast was already pretty good. So we're excited to get this live on our site. I'll leave it there today. Thanks for watching, and Eric will talk with you all on Wednesday.